Thanks, Kiki. Hello, everybody. My name is Erica Best. I'm the Associate Director of Direct Response at Share Our Strength, and I work on the No Kid Hungry campaign. I'll try not to cough or sniffle too much, but I did come down with a pretty nasty cold over the weekend. So please forgive my baritone voice and any potential sniffles you might hear. So I'm here today to talk to you about the power of one person and the power of stories in our fundraising materials. So just a little bit about the No Kid Hungry campaign. Our campaign is one of three run by Share Our Strength, which is our organization. Share Our Strength is an organization dedicated to ending hunger and poverty around the world, and No Kid Hungry is a campaign dedicated to ending childhood hunger in America. And so through proven, effective work, we're able to connect people who care to ideas that work. It's not that there isn't enough food in America to feed kids, it's just that the programs that connect kids to food aren't often accessible. And so we work to make sure that the kids get to the programs they need so that they can get the food that they need. And hunger affects children in every community in the United States, you know, rural, suburban, urban, rich, poor. There are kids who struggle with hunger all across the country. And so we really work to make sure that kids are getting things like school breakfast, summer meals when school is out over the summer, and other times when kids don't have reliable access to meals. So this is where we started. Even though Share Our Strength has been around for 30 plus years, the No Kid Hungry campaign is pretty new. It launched back in 2011, and that's right around the time that the direct mail and direct response program in general started. It was very small at first, you know, only 3 acquisition mailings, 7 house mailings, and I think we were going in acquisition to about 50,000 people per mailing, and in house it was you know, 5,000 to 7,000. And as we started to ramp up our investment in direct mail, we felt it was really important to test into new messages that were more donor centric, but we didn't know where to start. So just to give you an idea of what our language looked like back then, a lot of our copy relied really heavily on stats and moonshot language. So, you know, talking about the many millions of kids in America that live with hunger, we're going to end childhood hunger. And No Kid Hungry was pretty much the focus throughout. We very rarely talked about the donor or the donor's impact. I think a really good example of that is just that first sentence there. Today, more than 14 million kids participate in school breakfast programs on an average day. That's up from 10 million kids in 2010. So, I mean, that's fine. It shows that there's been progress made, but it's not super compelling, I would say. And when we start getting into some of these other messages, like hunger doesn't take a break when the bell rings, and then we talk about, you know, the tiny fraction of kids who are served after school meals, again, important numbers, but not really showing people what the actual problem is or the impact that this work has on kids who are hungry. So we worked with Donor Voice and our other consultants on a pretest tool. And one thing that came up because we were talking so much about ourselves and so much about our stats was this really interesting study and the identifiable victim effect. So in this study, they compared 3 appeals against each other. The first one only shared statistical information on the number of people who were hungry. So this one right here, food shortages in Malawi are affecting more than 3 million children. In Zambia, severe rainfall deficits have resulted in a 42% drop in maize production from 2000. So similar sort of message to what we were saying, which was very, you know, stats heavy, stats reliant, not really talking about what those food shortages and what the severe rainfall deficits mean for people who live there. The second story, or the second appeal shared a story of a little girl who is hungry. So one appeal with a person's story only. Any money that you donate will go to Rokia, a 7-year-old girl from Mali, Africa. Rokia is desperately poor and faces a threat of severe hunger or even starvation. And And the third appeal included both the statistics and the story. And it's interesting because I feel like that's what we do. We kind of marry the two in all of our appeals as fundraisers. So we'll say, 14 million kids are hungry in America, and then we'll tell a story about a kid. But what's really interesting is looking at donations, they saw a decrease in giving every time the statistics were present, even if a story was also present. So that really leads us to believe that that identifiable victim and the emotional sort of storytelling is way more impactful than, supplying sort of like statistical evidence of the problem. People can see the problem when you're talking about this little girl's story. And just to give you an idea of what the difference was between all of the different versions. So the identifiable victim effect works best when there's a single identified victim, not a group. There's a picture with a name and an age. The victim is a child. The victim's source of need is poverty, and the victim is not seen as responsible for their plight. So there may be other cases, but these ones are the ones that are currently found to be significant. And that's really, really important for us because No Kid Hungry, that's our whole thing. We have so many stories about kids who, their parents may have lost a job and they're not getting enough to eat at home. It's not their fault, and they need help. So No Kid Hungry was really an ideal candidate for testing out this sort of messaging. And so just to talk a little bit about some findings we had from our pretest tool with Donor Voice, we basically arranged a big old grid of messaging and offer and picture and signer options, and then we presented folks on our file the choice between a mix of those, and by kind of choosing A or B, we were able to narrow down what sorts of offers and messages and signers and stories would be most impactful for us, and then we would be able to take those findings out into the marketplace. So we wanted to see, first of all, who would be an effective voice for signing our letters. Most of our appeals up until recently had come from Billy Shore, who's our founder and executive chairman. And as you can see, his involvement produced the least exciting results. So what we found was that kids or parents were really the people that our donors wanted to hear from, with the winner being kids. So this first message is just, No Kid Hungry helped my school start a breakfast and after school meal program. Now I can get enough to eat. Thank you for helping kids like me. Sincerely, Desiree. Similarly, No Kid Hungry helped my daughter's school start a breakfast and after school meal program. Now she can get enough to eat. Thank you for helping kids like my daughter. Sincerely, Tanya, Riley's mom. And so this was really interesting to us because that seemed to support our hypothesis about the identifiable victim. And just one quick note, the scores show preference. So they range from 0 to 100. You can see that 86 from Desiree's is obviously many times better than the second place option, and many, many times better than kind of the last 4 options. Same piece of research. Here are the messages we tested around. We kind of asked the question like who or how you help. This top one is kind of a positive spin on the impact of food for a kid. So when I eat meals at school, it makes me faster, it makes me smarter, it makes me think I can do anything. I can work harder to have a better life. Thank you, D, age 8. And then we have kind of a negative spin on it down below. So I bring home ketchup packets and me and my grandma make tomato soup, but that doesn't fill me up. My belly hurts when I go to bed. And then we have some messaging around equal opportunity, the long-term impacts of hunger on children, stigma, and you being the difference between a child's success and going to bed hungry. So kind of like a little bit of a guilt trip message at the end. And again, we saw that those direct quotes from the kids were far and away the winners. I think the interesting thing here for us was that it was the positive spin and what the donor helped this child do and how it helped her feel good, as opposed to that more heartbreaking ketchup packet story, which could potentially make a donor feel guilty or bad and likely to help in the short term, but maybe not as likely to help in the long term. So the next step was to test this in market with our supporters. We had kind of all of our findings from the pretest tool that indicated that this was a good direction to go in. And so against our standard control letter, which again used a lot of that statistic information, you can see right here in the acquisition control, the first line is, did you know that 1 in 6 kids in our country face hunger? That's more than 13 million children. And you can see in the letter copy test, we really talked a lot about Chris and his brother and what it was like for them in the summer when they didn't have school meals to rely on. So you can see that from the results that we saw an increase in both acquisition and house of an increase in response rate, an increase in average gift, and an increase in revenue per piece. So this was really exciting. This story and this approach really worked for both new and existing donors, and it's really exciting. And in October, we tested a different kid's story, and we saw similar results. So again, 19% lift in response rate, 14% lift in average gift, and a 35% lift in revenue per piece. So what about extra info about parents and imagery? One thing that we go back and forth on all the time, again, getting back to that point I made earlier about the identifiable victim effect and it not being their fault, we were nervous to introduce any information about the parents or what the family circumstances might be, because we were afraid that people might focus on fair or not parental responsibility for feeding their kids versus just helping kids get the food they need, as well as whether or not images were something that we would want to insert into our mailings. So in our July 2019 acquisition, we had our control letter, which was Chris's story, last year's winner. The letter copy test, which included parents as part of the story. I believe Chris's mom had lost her job and things were tough for their family for a while they were trying to get back on their feet. A letter image test, so the control letter plus a picture of Chris, and an OE, an outer envelope image test, which was the same as the previous, but with the picture on the envelope. So something that was really interesting, once we introduced the parents into the equation, the addition of the information about Chris's parents increased the response rate, and the negative impact we saw in revenue wasn't significant, so we saw an increase in revenue per piece. So this is really good because we do have a lot of great stories where parents feature heavily that we weren't sure if we could use, but this seems to indicate that we might want to test a couple more times, but there doesn't seem to be any danger in kind of painting a fuller picture of a child's life and what the circumstances are in their life that leads them to be hungry. And compared to just the story, the addition of the image increased response rate even more. So 7% lift in response rate, 7% lift in average gift, and a 14% lift in revenue per piece. And this is one of my favorite pictures of kids that we have. He is so cute, I can't stand it. And adding his image to the outer envelope raised all of those metrics again. So it's really exciting. I think we have a lot more directions that we can go in. Nailing down, stories versus not stories was a good first step, and now we can continue to hone what parts of our messaging or imagery will really have a further impact on driving all of these key performance indicators. So how about online? We also used Facebook to test one of the winner stories from the pretest tool. You'll notice right away that this is not an A/B test. Don't freak out. We basically package tested this control ad that had been our good standby, our old faithful for a long time, against this one, which came directly out of the pretest tool. And what we found was that the quote with the kid had a much better CPA and a higher click-through rate. So now that we have a new control, or a winner from this, we can continue to hone it by testing the image, testing the headline, things like that, the call to action. And here's something that's very interesting. So we were feeling pretty gung-ho about the use of stories in all of our mailings, but the November and December acquisition told us a different story. So you can see that in November, response rate was down, average gift was down, revenue per piece was down. December was similarly wonky, better than it had been in November, but still not as great as we would expect, especially for year end. And we used the same control and test packages for November and December. So it was interesting to see this difference, given that they were sent a month apart and that the stories were the same. So our hypothesis about what went wrong here is that instead of telling one story, we told three. So we had what we were calling story snippets. So 3 stories about kids who were kind of describing hunger in their own words, or were in kind of dire circumstances, which was like, you know, this story about scraping together spare change to buy a small bag of chips. To confirm whether or not this hypothesis is what caused the decrease in all of our KPIs, our next step is going to be to test 1 story against 3 stories against our standard control letter. We also had challenges with our January renewal. There's this ketchup packet story that we touched on briefly during the pretest tool, which basically is just about a kid who was taking home ketchup packets and mixing them with water to make tomato soup. So we're looking to test different types of stories, as well as really narrowing in on finding just like 1 kid to tell a story about in the future. And some further test ideas to test for you is to test an emotional story of someone in need against one of your more institutional focused campaigns. I think, you know, as we've grown, we have basically an acquisition mailing every month this fiscal year, as well as house mailings almost every month. Our house file is way bigger. The number of people we're going out to in acquisition is way bigger. And I'm really glad that we were able to test into some of these ideas where we're telling stories about kids, we're showing the impact that a donor's gift can have on the kids. It's just a lot stronger, and I think really way more emotionally resonant than what we had been doing in the past. And the number of stories might matter, so keep that in mind. If you have 1 strong story to tell, that might be better than telling many stories. Again, testing will bear that out for us, but more to come. Maybe at the next symposium we can debrief. And the intensity of the reader's emotional response might also matter. So is a story too negative? You might want to test stories of different intensity. So again, what we found in the pretest tool was when we were able to frame a child's quote around how getting food helps them versus like the intense negative emotion of that ketchup packet story, that is a really good indicator that we might want to keep things more positive and focus more on the impact. And then finally, keep in mind that all donors may not need or want super emotional stories. So see how different segments respond to a story. We have another theory that maybe there are some folks who just really want to respond to an institutional message like a match or a renewal, and they don't really need to see or hear about these emotional stories. So thanks. I hope I didn't sniff too much into the phone, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Erica. No, you were wonderful. Nick, any questions?
We have one coming in. This is great information. Thank you. Do you think this study does or doesn't apply to major donor solicitations? This person has a hunch that major donors may want more statistics and measures of impact.
I think, yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I'm, when I'm talking about our results, I really am talking about people who are giving under $10,000 a year for the most part. Anecdotally, from working with Major Gifts folks for a while, and even our mid-tier team, I know that those sorts of folks like to have more impact-focused numbers and results. But I think that if you're trying to tell a story, it probably would be more impactful if you were able to weave in the narrative of a single child to demonstrate that impact. That's just my hunch, but I have a feeling that while there may be some major donors or mid-tier donors that just want solid numbers, you probably would move the needle a little bit with other folks if you were able to have a little bit of a narrative that followed some of these principles.
And there's a study on that from Carlin Wood. They tested education versus emotion in mail appeals, where they added in research information. 1/3 of folks, even explicitly, they cited the Yale researchers as the source of program effectiveness. And the information about effectiveness helped, but only for donors above $100. For below $100, it actually hurt. So the emotional with a mass market appeal is absolutely important one. Question from Barb: was your December revenue down overall? Theirs was, and wondered if that had an impact on the testing in November and December.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. It's really hard to separate out all of the variables from year end last year. We did struggle with our fundraising in November and December, like a lot of other organizations did. So I'll be interested to see this year when we retest if it was just the fact that things were not so great at end of year, or if it was a combination of using those 3 story snippets and the fact that it wasn't so great.
Erica, didn't you have the control and the conditions sent out in the same month? Because if giving was overall down in a single month, that shouldn't affect the test results if both conditions were sent out in that month. If that makes sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. We also, the other piece of this for us, it was in November and December, we have a match campaign running. So it could have just been that in November, those story snippets, didn't really work for our file. But then in December, when we sent the mailing again and we had the deadline, people are trained to give it year end before December 31st. So maybe that made a difference. I don't know, it's a little tricky.
Great, thank you. Question from Dana: how might we give one voice to a local climate change focused organization? For perspective, their organization focuses on 7 different action areas, like a coastal action, a wilderness action, a flood action. So it's hard to have that one voice sometimes. So your thoughts on that?
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess they all have, helping the climate in mind and making a difference for the environment. So is it possible to tell a story and potentially version it so that, like, you would tell a story from a climate activist about like a difference they made or a change they saw, or and then version it to the people who get the various different messaging tracks. So and your help could make a difference on the coast or something like that. I'm not sure. Nikki,
yeah, no, that's a great idea, Eric. And what I was thinking also is maybe you could anthropomorphize certain elements like animals or the planet even, and tell a story from their perspective. Or, as you say, is the whole idea of not sharing facts and statistics, but, as you said, tell a story.